In the early morning hours of April 29, 1903, a disaster struck the small mining town of Frank, in what was then the District of Alberta in the Northwest Territories. It happened so suddenly, so violently, that within seconds, an entire mountain side came crashing down, burying everything in its path. This catastrophic event, known as the Frank Slide, remains one of Canada's deadliest landslides, and a chilling reminder of nature's raw and unpredictable power. Frank was a young town, established just 2 years before, in 1901, when rich coal seams were discovered at the base of Turtle Mountain. It was named after Henry Frank, one of the owners of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company, which operated the mine that fueled the town's economy. The settlement quickly grew, attracting miners and their families, as well as businesses looking to capitalize on the booming industry. By April of 1903, Frank had a population of about 600 people. It had 4 hotels, a 2-story school, and a bustling main street. However, there were signs that all was not well with Turtle Mountain. The Blackfoot and Catoonaxa indigenous peoples had long referred to it as the mountain that moves, warning that the land was unstable. Scientists today know that the mountain was made up of layers of hard limestone sitting on top of much softer rock. Over time, water had seeped into cracks in the rock, eroding it from the inside. This natural instability was made worse by the coal mining operations that had been carving tunnels deep into the mountain. As miners dug out coal, they unknowingly weakened the mountain's structure even further. In the months leading up to the slide, miners noticed troubling signs. Small tremors shook the tunnels, coal broke loose from its seams unexpectedly, and pressure seemed to be building inside the mountain. Some workers even described hearing deep, unsettling rumblings from within Turtle Mountain, like the growl of something massive and restless. But, despite these warning signs, the town carried on with business as usual. Then on that fateful night, disaster struck. A sudden cold snap followed an unusually wet winter, likely worsening the already fragile conditions within Turtle Mountain. At exactly 4:10 in the morning, a deafening roar shattered the silence. A massive section of the mountain, measuring over 1,000 meters wide and more than 400 meters high, suddenly gave way. In mere seconds, an astonishing 82 million tons of limestone rock came crashing down the valley, moving at over 100 kilometers per hour. The rock slide was so powerful that it shot across the valley floor and even climbed up the opposite hillside before finally coming to rest. The force of the slide obliterated everything in its path. A 2-kilometer stretch of the Canadian Pacific Railway was completely buried. The coal mine's buildings vanished beneath a sea of stone. Homes and businesses on the eastern edge of Frank were instantly crushed. Some residents were likely still asleep when the avalanche of rock swallowed them whole. The sound of the disaster was heard as far away as Cochrane, over 200 kilometers to the north. As the dust settled, the true horror of what had happened began to emerge. Dozens of families had been buried alive. The once thriving town was now a broken landscape of shattered buildings and lifeless stone. The people of Frank had just experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in Canadian history, and in the coming hours, they would have to face an unimaginable reality, one that would change their town forever. But in the midst of the destruction, a few remarkable survival stories would soon emerge. The days leading up to the Frank Slide were filled with subtle warnings, signs that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of the disaster that was about to unfold. However, at the time, these signals were either ignored or dismissed as part of the natural behavior of Turtle Mountain. The people of Frank, like many small mining towns, were focused on their daily lives, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Miners working deep inside the tunnels of the Canadian-American Coal and Coke Company had begun to notice unsettling changes. Coal seams that once required hard labor to extract were now breaking apart with little effort, as if the mountain itself was loosening its grip. Some workers even reported hearing deep rumbling sounds from within the earth, though no one could agree on their cause. To many, it was simply the groaning of the mountain, normal occurrence in a place where rock and coal had been mined for years. Outside the mine, strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. Over the winter, cracks had appeared along the eastern face of Turtle Mountain, widening as snowmelt and rainfall seeped into them. When temperatures dropped at night, the water froze, expanding within the fractures and further weakening the already unstable rock. The cycle repeated over and over, slowly but relentlessly pushing the mountain toward collapse. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Blackfoot and Catoonaxa, had long warned that Turtle Mountain was unpredictable. Their oral histories spoke of a mountain that moves, a place that should be avoided. They had noticed the way the land shifted, the way the slopes never seemed to remain the same. But as settlers moved in and the mining industry expanded, these warnings were largely ignored. After all, coal mining was booming, and the town of Frank was growing quickly. People were focused on opportunity, not on what the mountain might do. In the days leading up to the disaster, the warnings became impossible to ignore. Small tremors rattled the town, shaking dishes on shelves and waking light sleepers in the middle of the night. On multiple occasions, sections of rock broke loose from the mountain's surface, tumbling down in minor landslides. Though unsettling, these events were not enough to stop daily operations. Life in Frank continued as usual, with miners reporting for work, trains running on schedule, and families going about their routines. Then, on the evening of April 28th, something even more disturbing happened. Workers inside the mine reported a sudden, powerful burst of coal gas, an explosive release of methane trapped within the rock. The force of the blast sent dust and debris flying through the tunnels, startling the miners. Many saw it as a bad omen, but with no real proof of danger. There was little they could do. Some men went home that night with an uneasy feeling, but others brushed it off as just another strange occurrence in a town built beneath an unpredictable mountain. As the town of Frank settled in for the night, no one could have known that within hours, Turtle Mountain would come crashing down, unleashing one of the deadliest landslides in Canadian history. In the early morning hours of April 29th, the residents of Frank were fast asleep, unaware that their town was about to be buried under a massive rockslide. Just before dawn, Turtle Mountain finally gave way. Without warning, a section of its eastern face collapsed, sending an avalanche of limestone boulders hurtling down at terrifying speed. The ground shook violently as millions of tons of rock broke free, crushing everything in their path. The slide moved with incredible force, covering over 2 miles in less than 2 minutes. Entire sections of the town were swallowed, homes and buildings vanishing beneath a sea of debris. The sound of the collapse was deafening. Those who survived described it as a thunderous roar that seemed to last forever. Some compared it to the sound of a massive explosion, while others recalled the deep, earth-shaking rumble that had woken them from sleep. Among the hardest hit areas was a row of houses located at the base of the mountain. Families were still inside, unaware of the danger until it was too late. Many were buried instantly as the rocks crashed down, their homes reduced to rubble in seconds. The slide also wiped out a portion of the Canadian American Coal and Coke Company's mine entrance, trapping workers underground. Miraculously, some miners deep inside the tunnels managed to survive as the collapse sealed off their exit, but left an air pocket intact. The destruction extended beyond the town itself. A section of the railway that connected Frank to the rest of the region was completely buried, cutting off communication and transportation. A passing train had been scheduled to travel through the area that morning, but by sheer luck it had been running behind schedule, avoiding certain disaster. As the dust settled, the once thriving town of Frank was left in ruins. Survivors who had escaped the initial collapse were met with an eerie silence. What had once been homes, streets, and businesses was now an endless stretch of jagged rock. In the chaos, people began to search desperately for their loved ones, calling out names and digging through the rubble with their bare hands. The sheer scale of the devastation made rescue efforts difficult, and as the sun rose over the mountains, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. As the morning light revealed the devastation, the survivors of Frank struggled to make sense of what had happened. The once bustling mining town was now buried beneath an unrecognizable landscape of shattered limestone. Families searched desperately for missing loved ones, but with so much destruction, the chances of finding survivors grew slimmer by the hour. Many were trapped under tons of rock, and rescuers had little more than their hands and primitive tools to dig through the debris. News of the disaster spread quickly. By sunrise, word had reached nearby communities, and help was on the way. Early on April 30th, a special train from Fort Macleod arrived, carrying Northwest Mounted Police officers and doctors ready to assist with rescue and recovery efforts. The scene was overwhelming. Piles of boulders the size of houses covered what had once been homes and businesses. The force of the slide had been so immense that it had even pushed debris up the opposite side of the valley. Despite the destruction, there were stories of incredible survival. Some miners, trapped inside the tunnels when the entrance collapsed, managed to find their way out through secondary shafts, stumbling into the daylight, covered in dust but unharmed. One of the most astonishing discoveries was that of a horse named Charlie. who had been trapped underground for over a month. He survived by licking moisture from the tunnel walls and chewing on wooden support beams. When workers finally freed him, they celebrated by giving him a feast of oats and brandy. Unfortunately, the sudden intake of food was too much for the animal, and he died shortly after. Amid the relief efforts, geologists and engineers began to assess the stability of the mountain, fearing another collapse. Some believed that the rock slide had been triggered by coal mining operations that had weakened Turtle Mountain's structure. Others pointed to the region's natural instability, noting that local indigenous groups had long referred to Turtle Mountain as the mountain that moves. Scientists sent by the Geological Survey of Canada inspected the mountain's peak and found new cracks forming, raising concerns about whether another rock slide could follow. Authorities debated whether to evacuate the remaining residents of Frank. Some officials insisted that it was too dangerous to stay, while others argued that the worst had already happened. In the end, the government allowed the town to remain, though certain areas were permanently abandoned. Years later, parts of the town would be relocated further from the mountain, as the threat of another slide could never be ruled out entirely. In the aftermath of the Frank slide, the town faced the difficult task of rebuilding. Though many families left, unwilling to risk another disaster, others chose to stay, determined to rebuild their lives in the shadow of Turtle Mountain. Over time, new structures were built, and the community adapted to the ever-present risk that loomed above them. The disaster also led to increased efforts to study and monitor the mountain. Scientists continued to investigate the causes of the slide, trying to determine whether human activity had played a role or if the collapse had been inevitable. The conclusion remained debated, but one thing was certain: Turtle Mountain was still shifting. Decades later, in the 20th century, monitoring systems were installed to track the mountain's movement, helping to predict any future rock slides before they could claim more lives. Though the town of Frank never fully recovered, the memory of the slide became an important part of Canadian history. The site of the disaster remains a haunting reminder of nature's power, with massive boulders still scattered across the valley unchanged since the moment they fell. Visitors from around the world come to see the landscape frozen in time, walking among the ruins of homes and businesses that were lost in the early hours of that tragic morning. The story of the Frank slide is not just one of destruction, but of resilience. Those who survived carried on, their lives forever changed, but their determination unshaken. Today, the site serves as both a historical landmark and a cautionary tale, a place where the past and present exist side by side, reminding all who visit of the unstoppable forces that shape our world.